Greeting everyone. Today we hear about the Transfiguration. This gospel invites us to reflect on mystical experiences that Peter, James, and John, disciples of Jesus, had. Mystical experiences are rare and often hard to describe. Have you ever had a supernatural experience of God? What was it like? Welcome to my podcast, A Psychologist Looks at Scripture. I am Peter Doherty, a Catholic priest and a psychologist, drawing from my background in psychology and scripture studies. I aim to provide unique insights into the Gospels and innovative pastoral teachings for Christians. The Gospels offer us a rich reservoir of knowledge about God and the development of our spirituality, with always more to uncover. Each episode of my podcast typically lasts between 7 to 10 minutes, during which I share reflections and insights that I hope will be beneficial to you. I welcome your questions and comments. Your feedback is invaluable. Today's podcast is from Luke chapter 9, verse 28 to 36, which will be read in churches on March the 16th, 2025. This podcast focuses on one of the most unusual gospel passages of all the Gospels, the Transfiguration. Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus in front of Peter, James, and John. This event seems unexpected, and following the event, the disciples are silent about the experience. They don't tell anyone. How could they possibly explain to someone what they saw and then expect to be believed? Many wonder why this event happened, or what may be the lesson that we need to know. There's no healing or apparent teaching. Some biblical scholars suggest that the Transfiguration is actually misplaced in the Gospel. They propose that the Transfiguration happened after the resurrection. I suspect it may be misplaced, but I'm not sure what the difference of interpretation would be. The choice of the two individuals speaking with Jesus was not accidental. Moses was known as the principal writer of the law, while Elijah is known as one of the greatest of the prophets. Theologically, the Transfiguration presents Jesus as the fulfillment of both the law and the prophets. This is heady stuff, and Peter, and presumably the other disciples, completely miss the significance. Peter invites Elijah and Moses to stay. I'm not critical of Peter because he was being hospitable and genuinely trying to be helpful. That may have been one of the reasons why he was invited to witness the event in the first place. All that aside, Peter misses and misunderstands what is happening. Yet, he invites Moses and Elijah to stay. He wants to hold on to the experience. Peter's experience mirrors our own experience when we are confronted with the divine in our lives. Those that have experienced spiritual or even mystical experiences know the difficulty of trying to share and to describe the experiences to someone else. Words don't seem to be adequate to describe what happened. Even today, 2,000 years later, we are unable to understand what happened, and maybe we're not supposed to. I am not sure if we're supposed to fully understand the depth and meaning of the Transfiguration, at least not in our lifetime. Perhaps the Transfiguration is a reminder that God's ways are different from ours. I know that may sound like I'm copping out of the question, but so often people seem to forget that God's perspective can be very different from ours. Jean Piaget, a famous Swiss psychologist, developed a theory of child development. His theory is not perfect, and there are valid criticisms, but he did introduce concepts that are nevertheless helpful in understanding human development. I won't go into detail concerning his whole theory. I will, however, focus on relative points. The second stage of a child's development, according to Piaget, is known as the pre-operational stage. At this stage, the child tends to be egocentric and struggles to see things from the perspective of others. I am not sure that we actually outgrow being egocentric. Some people find it very difficult to see another's point of view. Sadly, our world seems to be becoming more and more divided. People often making global judgments about other people, perhaps because they don't understand them, or simply it's based on a personality trait or a single experience or encounter. How do we respond when we disagree with God, or if we feel that God has abandoned us because he's not acting as we expect? Going back to Peter, who offers 3 tenths, not for himself, but for the visitors and Jesus, Peter did not understand, but to his credit, he acknowledges the goodness of the experience. He welcomes the newcomers. Despite misunderstanding, he remains open to the experience. Indeed, he wants to hold on to the experience. He inadvertently teaches us how to respond to the presence of the divine in our lives. I want to come back to the point I made earlier that maybe we are not supposed to fully understand Jesus, but have faith in him. To be more specific, I propose that if we are serious about growing in faith and spirituality, we must be willing to wrestle with God. In the Bible, there are several instances where individuals interact with God in a manner that can be described as wrestling with him, either physically or spiritually. Here are some key references. The most literal example of wrestling with God is from Jacob, who was returning to Canaan after many years away. He encountered a mysterious figure at the ford of Jabbok. They wrestled all night until daybreak. This figure, often interpreted as an angel, touched Jacob's hip, causing him to be wrenched out of joint. Jacob refused to let go until he received a blessing, after which his name was changed to Israel, meaning he struggles with God. We read this story in Genesis chapter 32, verse 22 to 32. While not a physical wrestling match, Abraham's persistent prayer for God to spare Sodom, if 10 righteous people could be found there, can be seen as a form of spiritual wrestling. Abraham repeatedly asked God to reconsider his plan, demonstrating a deep engagement with God's will. We read this in Genesis chapter 18, verse 16 to 33. Moses wrestled with his faith and God's commands when he was tasked with the leading of the Israelites out of Egypt. He questioned his ability to speak publicly and faced rejection from his Hebrew brothers, leading to a period of self-doubt and a spiritual struggle. We read this in chapters 3 and 4 in Exodus. In Psalms, we read about David, known as a man after God's own heart, who often expresses his struggles with faith in the Psalms. He faced numerous challenges, including personal failures and external threats, yet consistently turned to God in prayer and worship. I also want to draw your attention to Mary, the mother of Jesus, who treasured all these things and pondered them in her heart. We read this in Luke chapter 2, verse 19. I want to go further and to suggest that we should value those times and experiences when we wrestle with God or ponder God's will in our lives. When we wrestle with God or ponder, we are being curious and we are trying to understand. We bump up against God's action and realize that we are not God and that God's ways are not our ways. The more we realize and accept that reality, the more open we are to grow in our spiritual life. Like Peter, we need to be open to the presence of the divine in our lives. In many cases, we have to strive to be open to the Spirit. Often we want these experiences to last longer, but unfortunately, these moments will not last long. These experiences are a gift from God, reminding us that God is present. Thank you for listening. Join me next week when we go further into a passage from Luke, where Jesus calls people to change. He also points out that accidents and misfortunes are not meant as punishments for sin, or even as a sign of God's displeasure. If this is your first time tuning in, I encourage you to explore previous episodes available on various podcast platforms and YouTube. New episodes are released every Sunday, focusing on the upcoming week's gospel. Your feedback is invaluable for enhancing this podcast. I'd like to also express my gratitude to my team members, Heather Patel-Doherty and Richard Coulon, whose contributions are essential in preparing this podcast. For any questions or concerns, please reach out via email at peter.dohertyomi@gmail.com. God bless you all and have a blessed week.